Hi, I'm Nicole Jansma. I'm a recent graduate of Chicago-Kent College of Law. I'm also a member of the National Advisory Committee at Equal Justice Works. We're a diverse group of law students and law school professionals who serve as Equal Justice Works ambassadors within the law school and legal services communities. We're here today for another installment of the My Impact Alumni Series. This time we're with Dusty Weber LaMay, who is a 2018 Equal Justice Works Fellow. In this installment, we'll discuss how an Equal Justice Works Fellowship launched Dusty's career and hopefully inspire law students to follow their passion for public service and equal justice. So thank you, Dusty, for taking the time to speak with me today. And for starters, I'd love to hear what initially drew you to your specific issue area.
So just a little bit of context. My issue area was a focus on the civil legal needs for transgender people around Washington State, with a specific focus on folks who live in rural areas, or generally almost all the counties except for the two biggest, most populated counties. And there's two specific things that drew me to that work. So it was led by personal passion and personal experience and my witnessing of immense community need that surrounds me as a trans person. Had been navigating life early in life in Oklahoma and later in life in the West Coast, and kind of seeing what those realities are depending on whether you live in urban areas or rural areas, for meeting all kinds of needs and legal needs among those. And one of the things I knew from being trans and my personal experience, the experience of my loved ones and community, is that being trans is one of those identities where no matter what, you usually have an extra interaction with the legal system than most people, at a minimum, if you're going to get a name change. And then often, depending on what your other personal situation is, there might be medical navigation that you need help with that can involve lawyers or the legal system. The administrative processes for changing gender on your records can be really complicated, and even if it doesn't require a lawyer, is essentially legal information, and definitely legal process information. So there is just this sort of way that administrative processes require us as trans people to interact with these systems more often. And what I had noticed is that in rural areas, there was just gross underservice. In general, trans people are being underserved for their legal needs across the board, but all of the name change clinics, all of the gender ID clinics, all of these things were focused on big urban areas and getting the most amount of people. And kind of also assuming that, trans people should be going to these urban areas and getting out of these rural places and things like that. And all of that personal experience kind of led me to want to create a program to serve those communities that were being left out, and to push back against this idea that trans people have to leave where they're from or where they belong in these country places to go get the services that they're actually entitled to and deserve, that could be centered right there. This was all pre-pandemic too, so the digital world changed a lot in 2020, and I think that it changed outreach and it changed statewide access for stuff like this. So when I did my program and when I pitched my program, when I came up with the idea, it was all prior to Zoom meetings being the norm, right? And it was literally about taking these kind of services out into the field, into rural areas, which I still think is uniquely important. So that was kind of the background that led me to it. And I had seen some different Equal Justice Works programs over the years doing similar clinics, not always in rural areas. They kind of had two focuses where, EJW or Equal Justice Works had done, rural core kind of works, and they had some embedded, well-funded, over and over again, kind of a clear focus on trans and LGBTQ issues. So I was hoping that as a funder and as an incubator for this project, they would be a good intersection of that. I'm grateful that they were, because it worked.
That's really cool. What can you tell me about things that you learned throughout the course of your fellowship?
Yeah, well, I think that, first of all, that, you can take legal clinic-based supports on the road, right? There's other programs in our state that have been doing that, like a benefits bus for SSI benefits and things like that. So there is a way to take your programming outside of these centralized kind of like highly resourced urban areas, right? And especially in trans issues, we see that all over the country, where the vast majority of name change clinics on the ground that are funded at a level like Equal Justice Works work is funded, or that are consistent and long term, are going to be focused in these, Atlanta, New York, the Philadelphia area, DC, Chicago, San Francisco, Seattle, but even Seattle wouldn't be that regular sometimes. So um, there are these, large urban areas in predominantly very urban represented states. And so I think that this fellowship really taught me that, like, follow your gut. You know that rural people are out there needing these services. You just have to get out there and do it, and the need will prove itself, and it did. It was an incredibly successful program that still kind of goes on its own way to this day. It incubated many clinics and many different efforts that are still continuing. And I think that was one of the biggest, learning takeaways, is that, rural people deserve the services. They're there. They will show up for them. And I think one of the other big points that I got to, especially towards the end of my fellowship, was that the hybrid option does. There is a sort of like hybrid is necessary but not enough. I think was one of the big things I learned too, is that especially as we come out of the, not out of the pandemic now, but as things start to change and we're moving into this different way of living, I think that, hybrid allows us to reach into these communities in a way that's easier than me driving around all the state in a bus or a van. And also that in-person part is really critical. And so I think of it now as this learning process where hybrid is the doorway, not the endpoint, right? And the endpoint is still these in-person services for rural people that are deeply important. Um, I learned a lot about, how to make a statewide program, kind of all the general things that you might not get a chance to learn right out of law school, right? So typical jobs out of law school, you're going to be going right into doing stuff that other people have already done and need you to do, usually because their capacity is tapped, right? A first year attorney, or as postgraduate intern, extern, stuff like that. You're going to be doing a thing pre-designed for you. And I think that one of the really great things about particularly the Design Your Own fellowships from Equal Justice Works is that it really does let you be creative, and let my creative mind kind of design a thing and learn about how to run that thing, right? And so a lot of what I learned was about running a statewide program that I kind of built from the ground up, what it looks like to collaborate and network at a statewide level, what it looks like to meet the exact same need in 39 different courts that are all specific and not uniform, because Washington doesn't have a uniform court system. How to work with incredibly local entities on an effort that is statewide cohesive. And particularly, I think the broader thing that I took away from that is how do you address the really unique, specific, novel legal need from multiple creative directions that focus on everything except a lawyer arguing the case in court, right? This was really focused on pro se, or, direct community support for people who aren't going to have a lawyer doing it. And it was meeting one broad need of like name change and identity support, but there was a lot of different processes involved in that. And I think that gave me a really specific opportunity for learning about, project development, project creation, project management, and particularly like how to treat a population as a whole from a creative legal solution standpoint. And then particularly, how are you, like, one of the things that I think is still very relevant to my work today, a lot of this is, but it was the good beginning about how in my career for how to craft plain language legal material, right? Plain language is very much, I believe, the future of lawyering. And in the work that I do specifically now, it's incredibly important in my everyday job. But a lot of my work was about creating materials during the fellowship, was about creating materials that lived on an online document bank for the public to access, that involved info sheets, legal information, kind of little mini guidebooks, sample court forms, local petitions, a sample court novel argument out birth certificates that didn't exist anywhere else, and how to basically craft all of that stuff, but with the audience in mind that isn't lawyers, right? The audience in mind is the people you're serving, using language that they can understand, particularly because you might be the only lawyer they talk to through the process. So that was a really important skill I took away that I think you're not going to get in most other jobs. Equal Justice Works has such a focus on creating community focused materials and materials that can last beyond the fellowship that very often it goes beyond the like making sample briefs for other lawyers and stuff like that. And I think that gives you a really great opportunity for building skills in these arenas of lawyering that, particularly in social justice or public interest work, are becoming not only more the norm, but more the requirement for a lot of jobs. And yeah, and I mean, really, I think the last thing that I was thinking about that was a big takeaway is that, again, just it really drove home for me how important rural programming is. There wasn't, a rural county that I showed up in and that somebody wasn't needing services in or hadn't found out about the program. Um, and I think that across the board, regardless of what the other intersection of that is, I was just proud to be a part of and get a chance to be a part of something that let me focus on that kind of dedicated work for 2 years. And that if one of the big takeaways I think for me was definitely that rural work remains underfunded and the need for attorneys and legal services in rural areas is immense. And hopefully this kind of new way of being we've entered into the last few years with hybrid realities can help us meet that a little bit better. And could be a jumping off point for other fellowships where like mine was very much on the ground. It was not about doing remote clinics, right? It was about being in person and helping people, the lowest barrier possible. But I think that there's a lot of room for creating new fellowships, that kind of bridge that hybrid ability to get into rural areas.
That's all so incredible. All of those experiences are, like you said, not something that you're going to get typically right out of law school. So just absolutely incredible, all those experiences. I'm wondering if you can tell me a bit about a time in your fellowship when you faced a particular challenge in the work that you were doing, and how you navigated that challenge, and what you learned from navigating through that.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a little bit specific and nuanced to an issue, but one of the biggest challenges that I dealt with during my fellowship and continue to deal with to this day professionally is a very novel issue that affects trans people everywhere, and gender diverse people, whether they were born or live in a rural area or not, but it definitely shows up for a lot of folks who are rurally situated. And it shows up a lot for people here in Washington. So there's basically, like I'm born in Oklahoma, but I lived on the West Coast half my life. So when I've gone through changing all my documents to reflect my lived gender, instead of the gender I was assigned at birth, because I was born in Oklahoma, I have to go to Oklahoma's rules to update and change my birth certificate, even though I live in Washington now, right? Because Oklahoma issued the birth certificate. So it creates this very complicated process where no matter where you live, you have to go back to your birth state to update or change your gender on your birth certificate to, like, for example, to match my ID, which says male here in Washington state, and my birth certificate does not. So unfortunately for me in Oklahoma, that's not allowed. Oklahoma is one of the few states right now that has a ban on it and has effectively had a practical ban on it most of my life. So I've never necessarily had the option. Most gender diverse people do have the option to change the birth certificate, and it can be anything from a simple form like it is for those born here in Washington state or in our neighboring state, Oregon. But for about half the states in the country, it requires a really complicated court order, and it requires a complicated court order from the state you live in that didn't give you the birth certificate. So it's basically the most novel legal argument I've ever dealt with in my career at this point. And it's novel in the sense that there's not really examples of it. The judges locally don't know that they can do this because it's a very strange request. And you have to find a special local rule that says, hey, judge, you can do this. And then you have to convince them with an additional special, fleshed out argument saying the other state says you could do this. The other state has said you're the only one that can do this, So it's this it's like truly a definition novel legal argument. A big part of my fellowship was about how do we deal with this issue, because that is my life, right? Like I'm a rural trans person who's been dealing with this problem, and I was like, I don't have a solution for myself because of the ban in Oklahoma, but I know that most other people can get this issue solved, even if it takes some creative work. So it really did. I spent most of the 2 years of my fellowship working on a process where essentially, how do you train the public to do this pretty complicated legal task on their own without a lawyer? And then also, how do you train the courts to get ready for that, right? Because most of the courts had never even conceived of these arguments before, let alone seen them. And so basically, my fellowship was test running and doing that through the courts and kind of seeing how it would go and creating and drafting both a sample packet for people to take into court that was basically a fillable petition based on this kind of complicated novel legal situation. And at the same time, I also drafted a bench guide for judges that I went around and tried to educate any of the judges in the state that would meet with me about all the volunteer bars, and also provided to all of the Superior Court administrators for their judges, and would give with the packet for filing. It's basically like a small amicus, to essentially make sure that everybody got to the same place together about the issue. And that is often what is required. So I didn't pull that process out of thin air, right? I looked around at what do you do when you're trying to get a judge to understand this super nuanced personal issue that otherwise they're probably going to not have any experience about. And then beyond that, how do you get a judge to feel like they have the authority to give you this very special legal ruling that they have never seen before and that they may never see again, and that requires some incredibly crafty kind of legal arguing. So that was a huge challenge. It still is. Like I said, navigating that process is something I still do in my work to this day, and trying to kind of like bring both the sides of that issue to the same point of understanding can be really hard. I mean, and it's complicated for everyone involved. Like, recently I heard of a person who came through the clinic that I still run and help run, who had tried to do this 7 times. They went through the judge 7 times, and neither them nor the judge could figure out a way to make it work, because the sample petition that I have isn't readily available right now. It isn't in the public, or otherwise I would have gotten them already, and now I have. But hearing that like this is still years later, until all these birth certificate laws change all over the country, for people that move out of state, this is going to be an issue no matter where they live. So in Washington state, I think that has been a big part of my career, is trying to figure out all the ways to make these processes at a statewide level more equitable. Whether it was helping to change the ID process at a statewide level, helping to change the birth certificate process in Washington state for people born here. Recently helped work on the name change law that changed in Washington that helped expand the right to seal your name change and make it private here in Washington to include gender diverse people. So just kind of like, tackling one of these issues at a time, but the birth certificate issue is going to be one of the longest running ones because of the out of state part of it, right? Like all the states that require these things are going to keep on requiring these things. So that was probably one of the biggest challenges. It's like, how do we deal with this thing that nobody knows what it is, but people literally can't go on with their life or do this thing unless they get this court order. So, tackling it from all sides was one of the answers, right? And then really trying to make the most of local court rules and trusting that sometimes, I learned that judges aren't even the experts, right? And in fact, they don't always want to be the experts. They want you to give them all the information they need to sign a thing that says, I have looked at all this information and I can tell you that this seems like the expert information or what have you. So there was a bit of that part of that learning process. It's like, I can go in and tell the judges, you don't have to be the expert. Like, here is the expert stuff. Here is the prepared pro se. You just need to give them this thing they need so they can move on with their life. And that judicial education part is something that I think I wouldn't have had the confidence to do without Equal Justice Works. I mean, it gives you a confident backing for the work that you're doing. And it gives you this sort of like reputation and kind of vigor behind it that a lot of judges recognize. And I don't know that my fellowship would have been allowed on the door quite the same way without it. So that was a big learning process. And when I talk more about the work I'm doing since my fellowship, I'll talk a little bit about how I'm still dealing with that, and kind of a full circle moment I had with my work that I did in the fellowship, literally coming back to me recently so that I didn't have to rewrite the brief again for my current job. So So yeah, anyway, that was a pretty long little bit about number three there.
That was, I mean, that's fascinating. The amount of work you put into helping educate the judges and create systems there, that's incredible. And I'm sure it's something that you can carry with you after the fellowship and the work that you're doing. You already kind of touched a little bit on highlights and takeaways from your fellowship, but I am curious if there's anything that stands out to you as your biggest takeaway from your time in the fellowship.
Yeah, there were like kind of three things. I think the first, which I already knew, trans people are everywhere, right? Gender diverse people are in every county. They're very legally underserved everywhere they are. If you have any part of your work that overlaps with gender diversity or trans need, which is often beyond name and ID stuff, right? People always think name and gender clinics because that's like going to catch some of the biggest need, but there's so many creative legal ways to serve trans and gender diverse people right now. And if you can find a targeted way to have your passion and your fellowship work focus on them, there will be endless need. Just more and more so all the time. And so that was a big takeaway. I think I knew that, but I definitely meant a lot when I finally got out into rural areas and I would see just people coming out in all these different ways, right? And then that kind of piggybacks into some of my other, one of the other, I think the other biggest takeaway is like, pro se supports work. And a part of that is having, and that's one of the things about Equal Justice Works is that, again, because it's so focused on how does your impact last after the fellowship is over? Which pro se, creating pro se programs is one way, right? And that was, one of the challenges that I talked about was trying to educate the public and the judges at the same time. But that challenge was born of the goal that if we see all of this work in one lawyer or one lawyer kind of process, it goes away when that funding goes away, when that lawyer goes away, when that law firm decides to stop doing that work. But if you seek the work in the community and in this supportive outreach materials and the judicial education, it's going to likely carry on beyond the fellowship and beyond you. And so that was a huge takeaway. Like, pro se people are worth focusing on. Pro se work is worth doing. The kind of creative incubation that the fellowships give to these sort of projects is absolutely worth it. In a very, like, particularly for, I think, trans people and rural people, what I've seen over and over again is if you build it, they will come, right? Like, it might take a minute to build reputation and trust in both, trans and gender diverse community and rural communities, because, any isolated community and any community that's faced the marginalization that both those communities face have a lot of reason to be distrusting of new people at first, or new programs trying to swoop in and save the day, right? And so, but once trust is built, I think really it is, and if you build it, they will come. There's a huge legal need in both those arenas, and people are so grateful. And that holistic, really, like, the focus on holistic services, like, in the course of 2 years, I did a variety of different kind of public workshops. It wasn't always just name and gender change. Sometimes it was trans DIY estate planning, or like kind of doing your own end of life and life caring documents. Sometimes it was the judicial education and volunteer education. But when I was meeting with the public to do the clinics or do the public community education, the holistic approach of, like, we've got to get out of the law firms and into community, right? And that's one of the things I think Equal Justice Works is so brilliant at doing in really diverse ways, is if you look through all the different fellowships that have happened over all the years, which is something you should do if you're trying to pitch a fellowship, right? Go to the website, look through what's been funded before, look through what could get you inspired for ideas. It gives you the chance to take your passion and your work and your lawyering out of the office and out of the courtroom. So, like, I ran info groups at Starbucks. I ran info groups at libraries. I ran info groups in community spaces embedded in different counties. I ran info groups at little rental one-off spaces that I rented so people could feel private and safe. I ran info groups at the Pride events, and so on and so on and so on. So it really gives you a chance. I think that the opportunity to be in community is profound when you have the right idea and the right project. And you won't always get to do that for the rest of your career. So that was a big takeaway too, is that I think that was a really precious moment for me to be able to be out in the world doing field work like that. And I was really grateful for it and grateful to see how appreciative people were, to be able to say and see that someone and some program valued them enough to show up in their area and not be asking them to always do that extra step to come in to wherever they were to get services. Um, so yeah.
I love that. It really does kind of break down this wall that I think often exists between the public and the legal profession. You know, we created this very formal world of legal help, and so it's just really great to hear all those creative ways that you took that into the community and outside of the walls. So switching gears a little bit from the fellowship itself to what you're doing now, I'd love to hear about the work you've been doing since your fellowship.
Yeah. So I work for the Legal Services Corporation funded statewide legal aid entity for Washington State, which is called Northwest Justice Project. And then and we're about a 380-ish person civil legal aid law firm that serves the entire state of Washington. And actually, Northwest Justice Project, NJP was one of my collaborators and partners during my fellowship. So I would, because they are the state and federally funded legal aid in every county, and because they technically have offices in every county or serving every county, a big part of my fellowship was going around and training all the different offices and training NJP at their all staff on trans equity and just trans issues in court. So in some ways, my work in my fellowship was a minor project of the work I do now, or a sort of mirror project. So I work for Northwest Justice Project on a team called Washington Law Help, and we run WashingtonLawHelp.org, which is the legal aid website for Washington State. Similar, most states around the country. So whatever state you're going to law school in, most of the states have their federally funded version of WashingtonLawHelp.org. It's not always attached to the legal aid entity like it is in Washington, but ours are just one and the same. So some of our publications are court mandated and come with the eviction notices, for example, or some of the other court mandated notices. Oftentimes our website is the go-between before the court puts out its mandated forms, or if it's not going to. We're used by millions and millions of people every year. If it's exact to the numbers, it's like 1 in every 7 Washingtonian uses our website. And it's an online legal document bank for people who are trying to navigate legal issues without a lawyer. And oftentimes it's also a big training space for lawyers too. I used it immensely during my fellowship, particularly for legal needs that I couldn't meet for my clients that was like outside of name and gender issue stuff. So that's where I work now. I'm one of a few of the public legal education attorneys that manages all the content on WashingtonLawHelp.org, including all of the name and gender ID update stuff, which it has more reach than I could have ever had in the fellowship because of the reach of the website, which I'm very appreciative of. When I was building, so my fellowship was called TARP, Trans Advocacy in Rural Places. And when I was building the TARP mini online document bank, I was basing it on WashingtonLawHelp.org, but in a miniature way. And now that I work for WashingtonLawHelp.org, we're very background workers, so we don't have our names or staff attachment to the website. We have lots of opportunity for the public to give us feedback, and we do a whole lot of collaboration in the way that we build the material on the site. But I had a hard time during my fellowship trying to find out who ran WashingtonLawHelp.org because I wanted to pick their brain about building an online document bank. Now I work there. And so, it really, my fellowship truly was in a lot of ways a big incubation for the work I continue to do. We now at Northwest Justice Project are running a sort of just got started name and gender clinic that serves people statewide using the same kind of forms and resources I built during the fellowship. The birth certificate issues are constant. I essentially have continued to run my fellowship pro bono. Some of the work now has bled over into my daytime work at Northwest Justice Project. So, for example, we've been running name and gender ID clinics. The birth certificate issues are still constant. So for WashingtonLawHelp.org, one of our top 10 publications every week, thousands of people every week are looking at name change stuff and needing name change information. It's not always trans and gender diverse people, but definitely some of them are. So I've been able to use a lot of my material and skills and knowledge and expertise I built during the fellowship to build out all of our how to update your IDs pubs, how to change your name pubs, and working on a video series for the name change right now, because we also have a YouTube channel and do videos and stuff. But the birth certificate specific issue, so that is still a big problem. And we've been running our gender ID clinic at the new one just for a few months now, and every single clinic someone has showed up who lives in Washington, born out of state, needs one of these court orders, doesn't know what to do, got turned away by the judge 7 times. Everybody's still confused. And just for some context, my fellowship document bank hasn't been online since 2020, since the fellowship ended, and I changed jobs. So it's all of those materials, including that sample brief, aren't available. And the physical hard copies I have of them are in my storage unit. So I didn't have them available to me. And I was trying to remake the argument basically that I had in the sample petition that I made and built during the fellowship. There was a really good and sound legal argument that we tested in the court during the fellowship, and it worked. We need that again. And I was like, man, it would just be great if I could find a copy of this somewhere that wasn't buried somewhere in my old files that I had to dig through or whatever. I was like, I wish there was a digital copy. I wish there was a digital copy. So I started looking to just see if other states, if other fellowships, anything in other states had made this kind of argument, since technically all these states are interacting for this process. And weirdly, in the abyss of the Internet Archives, when I did that search, I found my old brief that had been left over from the fellowship that had been squirreled away in a Squarespace, literal just digital Internet Archive. And it was just a PDF of it, like it'll do when the HTML is gone. And it was perfect. It was better than I could have recreated, better than I remembered. And it was kind of one of those moments where and this was literally a week ago, 2 weeks ago. So my fellowship ended 3 years ago. And this was just a little time capsule through time on the internet waiting for me that is still supremely relevant to what I do today. I'm finishing, kind of fleshing out the argument. We're sending it back through courts. We're going to send it through the courts with our lawyers, as well as pro se folks. So, and that was literally a legal argument I built during the novel work of my fellowship to meet this novel need that remains so unmet that now in my next job, I'm resurrecting it to continue dealing with it. So it's, if you pick up, and this kind of gets into the next question a little bit, but if you pick a passion that really does fulfill you and that really does have ongoing legal need, you can keep on working on it long after your fellowship ends, and that work will continue to be relevant long after your fellowship ends. So I lucked out that I was able to go from a very niche plain language online document bank fellowship to a very niche plain language online document bank job. There are very few of those in the state or the country, and I know that. And so I'm very grateful that I was able to get the opportunity through Equal Justice Works to build those skills and get ready to do that. And I think it makes you very competitive to do that. I mean, that's the thing, is I was very well situated for the work I'm doing now because I was doing it in a smaller way through the fellowship before this, and lucked out that they were hiring right at the time that I needed a job when the fellowship was over. So there was a lot of serendipity there too. But that's what I do. And then, in my pro bono works, like I said, have continued. And so that most recently I helped worked with a group of people, including another fellow from my class, Danny Maxwing. We worked with a group of pro bono volunteers to work with Senator Peterson to change state law here in Washington state to increase access for sealed name change for people for gender diversity reasons when before it wasn't accessible for that. And just kind of continued to do different pro bono work when it comes up, in different ways. But luckily now I'm roping it into my 9 to 5 through our clinic as well. So, yeah.
That's awesome. That's really cool. It all came full circle then in your work now.
Yep.
So yeah, you've already given several amazingly helpful tips and bits of advice for current students, but anything you want to share with law students and lawyers who are beginning their public interest careers?
Yeah, I mean, find 1 or 2 career passions that are also personal to you, or the more personal, the better, and dive in. I think that one of the things that I've gotten to see both at Equal Justice Works and at Northwest Justice Project, where I work now, it's big enough that there's enough, you get to see that people's personal passions often do get to incubate into clinics or different kind of community-led models that allow you to do like more constant social justice type lawyering than casework typically can, particularly legal services funded casework, right? Which can be very limited and specific about what you can do. So if you get these, if you have any passion areas, like I wasn't even the one that started the name and gender clinic at Northwest Justice Project recently. It was some of our field office attorneys who were really interested in doing that and kind of reached out to see if there was expertise around help. And that's when I jumped in. So, um, you know, find find a passionate project or two that you can get behind, and there will always be legal need in that area. Um, and it will always be fulfilling for you to do that work. And a lot of times there will be jobs in those areas too. So not always, but if you can get paired up with a program like Northwest Justice Project, or it's big enough to incubate small clinic ideas and things like that. But in general, I think that there's starting to be a more and more social justice centered focus kind of across the board when it comes to looking for jobs, your first years out of law school. I think the main thing is getting that experience early on. We're all competitive, we're all passionate, right? So how can you be creative? Um, how can you do something that nobody else has been doing, or how can you meet a need in a way that's going unmet still, right? What are you bringing to the table that's specific to you and specific to your skill set and your experience and where you're coming from and what you can offer, and what is that specific change you can make? um, yeah, I think that would be some of my advice for sure. And apply for a fellowship. I mean, I try to tell everybody to apply, and I try to help folks as they go through that process if they're going to. I really do think um, Equal Justice Works, being a part of it as a national network and a part of it as a what I really think of as like an incubator, is a really special and precious moment after law school or in the early years of your career if you're able to get one. Um, I had a really great experience, and and they're not without bumps. Like I think that what I've seen is that no matter what or who your host org is, because you're working forward with Equal Justice Works, that's what guides that experience and controls that experience. And so um, the more that you can hitch to their ship those first couple of years out of law school, the better. I don't know. I'm just a big fan of trying to get a fellowship if you can. And I think the way to do that is find a passion that's personal to you, dig in, dive in, think about creative solutions, and do it with community in mind, right? So don't swoop in and Superman try to solve a problem. Um, don't be that sort of like diving in superhero that takes people's agency. Like go into the community that you're part of, the community you want to serve, and be like, what do y'all need? Um, what are people not doing for you? Particularly now that it's a hybrid quote unquote post pandemic world, is like, are people really thirsty for being back in person with each other? Are, courts, people struggling with being on Zoom because a lot of courts here are still on Zoom? I just feel like find your passion, get informed by community, and then get creative. And you'll be able to either launch into a great fellowship that'll launch you into a great career, or you'll launch right into a good career from there, even if you don't get a fellowship. And then there's won't be any lack of need. Like no matter what you're passionate about, people need you and need that help. And the more that I think the economy goes on and changes, the more that will continue. So, especially for folks that work at income-based like me.
No, that's so true. And I think, like you said earlier, Equal Justice Works does do a really, amazing thing in enabling students to think creatively about their passions. And so it gives that ability that you might not otherwise have right out of law school. So,
or otherwise after. I mean, I think that is, to not have to hustle so hard to fund your own program for 2 years, but get to just do that work is a really special thing. Like it's a special thing. And I think I'm grateful to Equal Justice Works for the opportunity that I had and for the funders that I had to make it happen. And I think that you don't totally realize that until you're out working in the world. You're like, oh yeah, like, I mean, I did know that to some degree because I'd been an executive director and stuff, but it takes so much hustle to get the amount of money that you need just to run a basic program for 2 years like this, right? And so to be able to have the privilege to just be like, this is my idea, and have someone give you enough money to do that idea for 2 years is a really cool thing. And it's a really unique thing. And it's something that I'm just, like I said, I'm very grateful to Equal Justice Works for the chance and that they valued that work too, and valued the work that got done in the communities that I got to serve during that time. But yeah, don't take for granted the specialness of it, because then eventually you're going to be moving into the rest of your life jobs where you're probably not getting to just do what you want on creative projects all the time. So
Absolutely. Well, this has been so wonderful. Thank you so, so much for taking the time to talk with me today. It was really a pleasure learning more about what motivated you to become an Equal Justice Works Fellow, and learning about your career after the fellowship. And obviously, thank you so much again for your continued commitment to helping increase access to justice for rural transgender people. So thank you for the work that you do, and thank you again for talking with me today.
yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for interviewing me.